Bob, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to join us here on APTN InFocus.
Well, I'm very happy to be able to participate today.
So first off, can you tell us a little bit about your organization and what you guys do?
The First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance has been in existence for about 8 or 9 years. And what we do is it's a network of First Nations across the province of British Columbia. And what we do is we've been, in the past stretch of time, been really focusing on the protection of wild salmon and looking for the opportunities where we can advance food security with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in the province of British Columbia.
So what's the current state of salmon in BC and some of the surrounding areas right now?
Well, the salmon state in British Columbia is not very good. We've had historic low returns for successive years to the Fraser River, which has been the backbone of British Columbia in many ways and for very many First Nations. But what we're seeing this year, there was a slight increase in one of the salmon runs on the Fraser River. And so there was a lot of attention about this extra increase of food social ceremonial catch. But the thing is, when you look at the entire province, and especially the Fraser River, we're still in a very difficult spot. And we need to be able to take the necessary steps to remove the man-made impediments and be able to provide true food security for the vast majority of First Nations in British Columbia.
And just on that note, how is this affecting the First Nations in the province?
Well, we go years, and it's sad to say, but decades without our traditional foods. You can see in the back here, I've got a couple of cases of sockeye this year. I've got 4. It's the first time in 2 decades that I've been able to say that I have salmon in the cupboard for the winter. And yet this is such a fundamental food source for 90% of the First Nations in BC. And when we see government continually make very poor decisions in terms of protection of salmon and actually supporting an industry like the open net cage fish farms, which have a direct impact on our food security, this has been a great issue that's been a large amount of focus. And it's only until recently that we've had a government that is willing to step up and make a transition of fish farms from the oceans of British Columbia.
So just on that note, you just mentioned, your organization's against these fish farms. How will the removal of these fish farms help the salmon stock and the salmon numbers sort of rise?
Well, first, the First Nation Wild Salmon Alliance is in favor of protection of wild salmon. And if it happens to be fish farms or logging practices or impacts of wildfires and floods, these are the things that we advocate for the appropriate political response and the allocation of resourcing. But when we look at the support to the open net cage fish farms from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for as long as they have, it's like they've lost the script. And what I mean is their primary responsibility of looking after the environment and wild fish, which includes wild salmon, but also by not fulfilling their obligations of the Crown fulsomely, they're walking away from upholding Supreme Court of Canada law, the Constitution of this country, and certainly commitments that they've made in terms of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so now at this time, we have a Liberal government that it appears that they're paying greater attention to the state of wild salmon. And as I mentioned, there's like 90% of the First Nations in BC rely upon wild salmon. And when you look at that in terms of the national context, that's almost 1/3 of all the First Nations in Canada. So it's a critical issue.
And along with that, is there any other specific reasons why there might be a decline in these salmon numbers that you've seen?
Well, we had the Cohen Commission report on absent sockeye from the river quite a number of years ago. It was about 10 years ago. And it listed a whole range of issues and impediments to wild salmon. It's a very, I've had people say to me, it's not rocket science, it's actually more complicated. And so when you think about all the things that have to line up in order for salmon to do well, it's complex. But what we've been focusing on is the Wild Salmon Alliance, or where are there opportunities to reach out and touch man-made impediments and impacts to wild salmon. And with the emerging science that's come about on fish farm interaction, disease, pathogens, sea lice, and its impact to wild salmon runs, and knowing the DFO knowingly hides these and misinterprets science to the decision makers, it's a big red flag. And as a result of access to information, we've been able to identify a pattern that the DFO Pacific does to actually undermine the decision makers and the previous and now current Minister of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Well, that's certainly interesting there. So then how do we get these numbers back up, Bob?
Well, first we have to start looking at how do we protect them. And then we need to work and prioritize watershed work with First Nations, the provincial government, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And the province has a very important role to play as they make decisions in watersheds for logging and mining and a whole range of other things. But what we need to be able to do is sit down with the Crown and First Nations, and by doing that, implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And then we can start to prioritize the work that needs to be done. Some of it's going to be quite obvious, like the watersheds that have been annihilated by wildfire, where there's flooding occurring and the repair that has to occur there. But it's an amazing array of policy and regulations that need to be examined and altered if we want to see salmon continue for generations to come.
Now, are there any short-term and or long-term goals when it comes to getting these salmon numbers stable again that your organization is looking at?
Well, the short-term goal is to organize First Nations and identify them to participate and support the Liberal government's commitment to transition fish farms from the oceans of BC. It's in the ministerial mandate letter to the DFO minister. We've identified in the past couple of years, actually right when COVID first began, 102 First Nations that support this decision of a federal government. And the three organizations here in British Columbia, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, BCAFN, and the First Nations Summit all have resolutions supporting the same. So it's clear the majority of First Nations in British Columbia want to see the fish farms removed. So this is an opportunity that's at hand right now. And then we can start to look at what are the other impediments we can reach and what are the solutions we can bring into the watersheds, which benefits the environment, it creates employment and a whole range of other benefits. But it's time that we do this and hopefully be a once-in-a-lifetime investment in wild salmon in British Columbia.
And lastly here, Bob, in your experience, there's been calls up for the increase of salmon numbers, here and there over the last, I don't know how many years, but is this time maybe a bit different and a bit more urgent, do you think, than some of these other times? Like, is it sort of a now or never time for these salmon numbers?
It definitely has that feel about it. And when we have historic low returns to the Fraser River, it certainly captured the attention of many First Nations and the government. And then, of course, with the growing awareness of the impacts of global warming and the wildfire situations and so on, I think the awareness now of the work that is required, because I know that wild salmon have supported the province of British Columbia economically, but when you think about what it means to First Nations and our traditional food sources and our culture and our traditions, it's irreplaceable. And so this is, I believe, why we have had the enhanced attention on it. And it's too bad that it took the historic low returns and the absence of salmon, like, no cases of fish like I have, to grab people's attention. But be it as it may, we have the focus now of First Nations, the federal government, and importantly, the provincial government would be in support of financially. And so it's the opportunity now to actually start making meaningful steps for food security for First Nations. But of course, that means for the environment, it means for all British Columbians. And we're not the only ones that have traditions and culture around salmon. I mean, a lot of people have gone fishing with their father, their uncle, their grandfather, and wish to do that as well. And so that's the work, and the reason why we do it is so that all people that have an interest in salmon, in addition to those of us that have constitutionally protected rights, are able to enjoy this amazing gift from nature.
Well, it's certainly well said, Bob. We will have to leave it there. We are running a little short on time here, but I want to thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to share your insight and your knowledge with us about what's going on in BC and these salmon numbers.
Well, thank you very much, and hope you have a great day.